Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. It's great to see people who are people from all over the islands and also Washington. And wow, thank you so much for joining us. Dallas, Texas. It's great that we can share this space together. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll just give another moment for people to log on, and then we'll get started. Hey, well, aloha everyone, and welcome. Welcome back to those who attended previous experts lectures. My name is Andrea Nandoskar, and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. And I want to thank you for joining us today. This is the 37th Annual Experts Historic Preservation Lecture Series. I want to mahalo our event partner, Dr. Ralph Kam, the curator of the expert series, and Dr. Kam is the executive director of Hawaiian Mission House's Historic Site and Archives. The series is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program, the University of Hawaii at Manoa School of Architecture, and Historic Hawaii Foundation. And this year's theme, for those who are joining us for the first time, is Hawaii's Historic Preservation Pioneers. And today's presenter will speak about Henry Inoka Palenapa Kekahuna. Just a note, yes, all the lectures are being recorded. They're also being live streamed. You can watch and share them immediately after today's presentation from HHF's YouTube platform and Facebook page. And if you have questions, and I hope that you will, please just type them into the chat as they come up and I'll collect them. And Dr. Kam and our presenter will engage in conversation and respond to questions at the end. The last thing, there is a brief survey at the end, and mahalo to everyone who has been attending previous lectures for providing your responses. And if you can do so today afterwards, it will pop up right after we close out. It's really helpful for us. For those who may be new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit, and we help people save historic places, sites that tell the stories of the many layers of history of Hawaii. We do it through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. We were founded in June of 1974, and 2024 is our 50th anniversary. So we're excited to celebrate this year, the series of different events, including this one. I now would like to warmly welcome Dr. Ralph Kam, who will introduce today's presenter, and I hope you enjoy the lecture. Mahalo.
It's interesting on how all of these speakers somehow tie together. I was listening to Patricia Morgan last week when she was talking about the Daughters of Hawaii, and she mentioned Hulihei Palace and the efforts to protect that site. Just across that bay is Ahuena Heiau, and that was one of the sites that Henry Kekahuna was attempting to protect. So I'm looking forward to Kekuewa Kikiloi and his talk today. He's very well versed for this subject. He is a graduate of Kamehameha Schools and obtained his PhD in anthropology, archaeology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And his educational background primarily in Hawaiian studies and anthropology, where his research is focused on understanding the nature and complexity of traditional Hawaiian society, and also bringing this knowledge to bear on cultural revitalization efforts today. Over the past 25 years, he has worked in the cultural resource management area and research in Hawaii. He has held various positions, such as the cultural program coordinator of the Moku ʻŌiwi Marine National Monument and the cultural assets manager at Kamehameha Schools. His interest, passion, and commitment lie in the protection and stewardship of wahi kupuna, ancestral places, and the revitalization of inuiākea customary practices. He is currently an associate professor in Kamakakūokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies at UH Mānoa and serves as the board president for the nonprofit organization ʻŌiwi. So without further ado, I present our speaker for today, Kekuewa.
Aloha mai kākou. Welcome everyone to this talk today. Thank you, Andrea and Ralph, for inviting me to be a speaker here. And thank you, Kirsten and the entire Historic Hawaii Foundation for all the important work you folks do to protect important places in Hawaii. Today, I'll be talking about the life and the work of a man named Henry Kekahuna. When Andrea and Ralph approached me about this, I was actually kind of nervous, surprised, also because I didn't know that it must have been coincidental because I haven't really talked to a lot of people about, being a fan of this man's work. So I was caught a little bit off guard that someone would ask me to talk about him. But at the same time, I also felt really obligated because I know that a lot of people don't really know his work and what he's done. And I thought I could speak on it pretty well, and so I gladly accepted, speaking on this topic today. My talk today is called From a Native Son, Henry E.P. Kekahuna's Kekahuna, a glimpse into his life's work and contributions to Hawaii's historic preservation. And I put that term glimpse because really, the more I dug into his life, the more I kept finding. And also, there was a little bit of worry on my part just because, I typically research land and cultural practices. That's like my forte in what I do. And here I was sort of researching a person's life, which was a little bit different. And so Henry Kekahuna, he died in 1969, like 6 years before I was born. And so, he's a person of our past, but then at the same time, he's close enough to the modern era that, people knew him and knew about him on a personal level. And so I want to really make sure that I'm doing justice here and trying to be as accurate as possible. And then there are definitely some, gaps in sort of the record that I wasn't really able to sort of find regarding his life. And so I'll make some educated guesses or inferences, but again, take some of that with a grain of salt because I did not talk to anyone living today that knew him, which is probably something that should be done if this kind of biographical sort of sketch of him is continued. And I primarily looked at his life and his work through archival records, and in particular his collections and the collections of one of his very close associates, who I'll also be talking about today, Theodore Kelsey. Yeah. And so let's go ahead and start. Okay. So Henry Enoka Palenapa Kekahuna lived from 1881 to 1969. He was born on the east side of Maui in a place called Hamoa in Hana, and in particular in a hill area called Pu'uninau. His father was Barenapa Palenapa Kekahuna, and his mother was Carmen Kamala Kahavalu. I don't know much about them. I was able to find, genealogical information about him. But I will say that, his middle name's Inoka Palinapa, and then the father's first name, Barinaba, are like Hawaiianized Hebrew terms that are tied to the Bible. And so I don't know enough about the Bible to kind of go into an analysis of that. So I'm just going to leave that there. But I think we can assume that he was probably raised in sort of a Christian household. But interestingly enough, you would never tell that from his work because he almost never mentions any of that. And in fact, he's always pushing sort of a deeper understanding of Hawaiian customs and beliefs that were traditional. Yeah. Kekahuna, who I'll refer to Henry Kekahuna just as Kekahuna during this talk. During his lifetime, he was raised in both Olala Hawaii and English. Judging from his Hawaiian language on the audio tape interviews that I listened to, he's definitely a native speaker. And I mean, we might also infer that like English was probably maybe even a secondary language when he was young, because his English sounds a little bit like his Hawaiian, to be honest, the way the cadence of it, the intonation and all that. So it seems like Olala Hawaii, he's much more fluent in it, when he talks. He was later educated in Hilo boarding school. During his lifetime, he became a prolific scholar, one that probably wasn't acknowledged enough for the work that he did and the contributions he did. And in particular, he was an outspoken advocate for historic preservation and the protection of the Hawaiian archaeological record and sacred sites throughout our Paeaina. His work would take him throughout the Hawaiian archipelago, despite having lost his left leg at the age of 18 when he fell off a railroad car on a Sunday school outing. And so that was something that actually shocked me, because for the past 20 years, I've been looking at records from this guy. And it was only maybe 10 years ago that I saw a picture of him and I realized that he didn't have a leg. And so, which really kind of blew me away, to be honest, because all of the work that he did in terms of like the field work and the mapping was done basically on one leg, and he was disabled. But you would never tell that from how prolific his impact was. Let's see. There is sort of a big gap actually in his life story, and which is another interesting aspect of him. Yeah. And so we definitely know that through an account of his through audio recordings that he was doing research at an early age, and even into his early 20s, early adulthood, he was concerned about the loss of Hawaiian knowledge. In 1903 and to 1905, he embarked on an ambitious expedition, I would say, to gain an understanding of Hawaii's historic preservation problems. He traveled around Hawaii Island. I mean, this is early, right? 1903, 1905. He traveled around Hawaii Island on foot, recording and documenting information from scholarly old Hawaiians in their different areas. So he began in Hilo. He walked the length of Puna to Waiohinu and Ka'u. From there, he caught a boat to Kona and traveled through Kona up until Kohala and then around Hamakua, making his way back to Hilo in about 2 years. And it took him that long because he was very interested in, spending time in different places and trying to learn about these places and what the community was, well, really the realities of what the communities were facing in regards to the protection of cultural sites and the preservation of cultural information. Along the way, he made friends, and he lists in his recording some of the family names that I have over here that he encountered in different districts that were kind enough to let him live with them for a period of time as he, went from place to place, ahupua'a to ahupua'a, and trying to meet all of the old timers to interview them and record them. Um, you know, he along this trip, he has, a few stories, and some of the things that I thought was interesting was his commentary about how knowledge of the landscape was starting to be lost already by 1903 and 1905. And so when he went to different places, in some cases, like the people over there didn't know all of the place names of their place. And amazingly, he was such a student at the time, he knew a lot. And so, he was talking to a lot of different kupuna along the way as well. So he was just amassing a huge amount of cultural knowledge about Hawaii Island in particular. And he would ask about place names and stories, and in some cases, the people knew them and the old timers knew them. In other places, they had already forgotten, certain things. He also commented about how family practices are changing. He noticed, like, when he was staying with families, back, earlier on, families and storytelling were a big thing. And so families and extended family members would take turns telling stories at night. And they would, eat pupus and talk story and tell stories, and everybody would be totally engaged in this process. And then when it got really late, he talked about how everybody would kind of drink ava and, turn in for the night. But as he was going around, he noticed like people weren't doing that as much anymore. And that was also what he thought was part of the problem of the sort of the history sort of slipping away during his time. Um, Henry Kekahuna, I think he has like a really unique perspective on cultural revitalization because of just the time in which he lived. If you think he was born in 1881, so Hawaii was still independent, right? And a kingdom, a nation state. And so he lived during a time in his young childhood when Hawaii was still the kingdom of Hawaii. And then later on, he, as a young adult, he was, squarely in sort of the territorial period. Yeah. And I would say that the territorial period, as it sort of dragged on towards statehood in 1959, was probably one of the hardest times to be Hawaiian. Yeah. Because you have the slow erosion of cultural practices and knowledge, people dying off, lands being developed. And so he saw all of this happening, and you can see it sort of in his work, like in the way he does his work, in the way he goes about his advocacy in the community, is that he is really determined and driven to try to protect all of these things that was dear to him. Some of the things that I thought was amazing, about this story, besides the fact that he was, he only had one foot and he was walking around the entire island, was that, he really emphasized the importance of building relationships with the local natives everywhere he went and the old timers. He saw the importance of a living record, and especially in a time where I feel like anthropology was so fixated on sort of the dying of the native, yeah, the disappearing of the native, that you know, we weren't gone and we still aren't gone. But Kekahuna recognized that because that was his people, and he had really an insider perspective on how he went about doing research and what he knew was important in applying it to research. And so this is just one account, I guess, and kind of really the main account that I found early on, like in his 20s, of what he was doing. I will say that there's a huge gap in his 30s and his 40s as to what he did in life, yeah. Because there's nothing that pops up on him during those 2 decades except genealogical information about his family, census records, and things like that. We do know that by 1911 he met his love, Ida Ferreira, who he married and later had 5 sons and 3 daughters, and that can keep you busy for 2 decades for sure. They moved to Oahu and lived on Palolo Avenue. And interestingly, as just a small note in sort of an article when he dies, it mentions that his occupation was actually an accountant. So he worked as an accountant, and that his hobbies was Hawaiiana and archaeology. That's what the article says, right? I would beg to differ. I really think that his passion was Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian knowledge and archaeology. And that accounting was probably just his occupation, that he needed to raise a family, yeah, because his entire legacy and contribution is really, in that area of cultural revitalization. And so during those 20 years, he didn't, there's not a lot of sort of things to look at, in the archives around his production, and his scholarly work. And it's not until 1936 that we start to see sort of the resurgence of Henry Kekahuna, really. And I say that totally amazed because really the most prolific stage of his life is from age 55 to 70. Like the amount of work he produces in those later years is phenomenal. Like a lot of us can't even produce that in our prime, And so in 1936, I think his life changed, when he changed professions and he started working as an archivist at the Territorial Archives, which is now known as the Hawaii State Archives today. And here we have a picture taken in 1937, and you have Kekahuna over here, right over here. So he's in his 50s when he starts working there. And it's really at the archives that I think he was honing his skills in a lot of ways. It's clear that he grew up steeped in Hawaiian tradition and that he had a thirst for Hawaiian knowledge. And I'm sure that passion and that thirst carried over to those missing years of the 20 decades that, he wasn't, publishing or anything like that. But, I think this job at the archives really set him on fire, in terms of like his passion, because it was something that he wanted to do, something he wanted to be there. Yeah. And one of the things that I noticed about some of the his collections is that archivists sort of at that time, I think, are maybe a little bit different than how we see sort of library sciences and archives sort of today, where so much about it is conservation, which it always is, right? Protecting the records and understanding how to catalog and all that. But he was really doing research while he was there, and honestly, I felt like he was more of a researcher than an archivist, because he's producing things, manuscripts, and recording, like doing original documentation, and building a whole collection under his name of things, while he was there. And so, a much more sort of active approach, I think, to archives back then. Maybe because it was in its younger years, more of its infancy, and they were trying to build it up. I'm not sure. But really, it was at the Territorial Archives that his life would change, because he met a man named Theodore Kelsey. Theodore Kelsey in this picture is right above him. They would become best friends. And I was fascinated by this because Theodore Kelsey is Hawaiian, yeah? And he's not from Hawaii, but he moved here when he was young. His family moved here when he was only 10 years old to Hilo and Hamakua on the Big Island. He was interested, I'm talking about Kelsey, was interested in Hawaiian language and photography at a young age, and that would influence the type of work he would do, more squarely sort of in ethnography and interviewing community members about knowledge, and recording it. He was recruited by the Bishop Museum to go to college when they offered the president, or the director at the time, offered their support to pay for his college if he would go into anthropology and ethnography and then come back and work at the museum. But, he had a strong pilina and connection to Hawaii, and he never made it to college, and he just wanted to do work, right? And so both Kekahuna and Kelsey, for the most part, seem to have been sort of self-taught researchers. Yeah. And as a result, I think that's one of the reasons why people kind of know their names today, but they don't know really a lot about them because they weren't as high profile as other researchers at the time. So Kekahuna and Kelsey developed a deep friendship and a common bond in doing ethnography, interviewing, living community members and recording cultural information. Obviously, using archival research as well to look into the past and try to understand it from that perspective. In one of the interviews from Kelsey, they must have been really close because Kelsey called him his Kōkō, which is like his partner, like in all things, And he even joked that he was the left leg of Kekahuna in his interview because he was basically helping him hop along and running tape for him while he was mapping archaeological sites. And so both of them had a good career as archivists at the territorial archives. And if you folks are interested in learning more about their collections, there's two major collections. One is at the Hawaii State Archives today, because that's originally the territorial archives. And then also Bishop Museum has a collection from them as well. One of the unique things I think about their friendship is that oftentimes when we think about historic preservation, there's sort of this unspoken tension maybe of between Haoles and Hawaiians and sort of outsider insider sort of perspectives, but it's pretty clear here that these guys were like the best of friends, so much so that like when you look at their letters to each other, they kind of remind me of like two grumpy old men that keep complaining, but then they're really close and that they can be super open with each other. And so when I read their letters, I kind of laugh because I know they're super good friends, but they're kind of like taking shots at each other and criticizing and what people do when you are super close. But it's during that time that they amass sort of these collections. Kelsey is again squarely sort of in ethnography and Hawaiian language resources. He has an amazing collection on chants. And one of the few people that like sort of analyze chants in the way that in sort of like a makavalu kind of way, I guess is would be the way to sort of describe it, where you're looking at it from multiple perspectives, but not the multiple perspectives of one person. He is actually looking at chants line by line, multiple perspectives of native speakers that are cultural practitioners. And so, he'll take line one of a chant, and then he'll have 7 footnotes, each with the translation and interpretation by 7 different experts in chant, And so for someone like me that loves chant and researches chant, when I see that kind of stuff, I was like, wow, this guy was on another level, man, in terms of like the detail and depth that he was trying to go for in his sort of recordings and analysis of the ancient past. Likewise, Kekahuna stuff is just as prolific, right? You have a incredible range of topics that is in his collection that can range from Hawaiian customs and beliefs, cosmogonic chants and stories, chiefly genealogies, hana no eao and making particular crafts, rituals and ceremonies, chants and songs, place names. I mean, the list goes on. And so if you were to go there, especially the Hawaii State Archives, there's boxes and boxes, not really indexed really that well. So you'd have to kind of grind through the boxes to get to the nitty gritty, but still like you could spend literally days there just going through his collections and trying to see what he was kind of richness that he recorded. Yeah, so Kekahuna, again, it's clear he honed his skills with Kelsey in the archives as researchers of the written recorded knowledge, and then also relied heavily on both of their backgrounds in doing ethnography and interviews in the community. They're weaving those two things together. One thing that's not clear to me even still is sort of like, how did Kekahuna learn archaeological mapping and sort of documenting sort of on that level? And so I think some of it was probably self-taught, because when you look at the products of what he was making sort of archaeologically, especially his maps, they actually don't really look like archaeological maps that were produced by people that went to the university and that got degrees. And I'm not saying that as a slight against him. I'm actually saying that that's something that's really interesting to me about this man. And so, that work in sort of the archaeological realm was, one huge part of sort of Kekahuna's legacy as well. And so, as their friendship grew, over the years, both Kekahuna and Kelsey kind of lamented really about the loss of not just cultural information, but cultural places, because they recognize that the cultural information, if it's not tied to the place, becomes sort of divorced from the reality of things, right? You can't really envision what happened if the place is no longer there and you're just telling a story of something that doesn't exist anymore. And so in their older ages, both Kekahuna and Kelsey leave the archives, and they embark on some of their most important work when they're, Kekahuna is reaching 70 years old and Kelsey is in his 60s. Again, mind blown. I'm in my late 40s and I get tired just chasing my dog around. These guys are doing like hardcore field work at that age. And it's not like small stuff. It's like unbelievable how much they can accomplish in that 10 years. And so what they're doing is sort of essentially contract work. I'm not sure how they get into sort of the sort of these connections with the national parks and the territory and stuff like that, but they're able to convince them that they should be funding work in particular areas, because a lot of these archaeological sites were under immediate threat at that time. And so, some of these archaeological sites are still here today thanks to their, good work in advocacy and protection. And there's, much more than this, obviously, across our archipelago. But I think the integrity of a lot of our sites has been diminished greatly. And that, if you're looking at sites in the 1950s, there's just a much higher level of integrity of these archaeological sites than what you see now. So, both Kelsey and Kekahuna were worried about the loss of these things. So they set out on a series of ambitious ethnographic and archaeological projects that would take them across all of the islands to document in detail important cultural sites and places. A large portion of the work actually focuses on Kona, because at least on Hawaii Island, they felt that Kona was the one place that was under the most immediate threat, and then it had some of the best preserved archaeological sites at the time, versus other districts that were, for the large part, clear-cut entirely for sugarcane and other types of works where land is grubbed and graded, basically, and so you don't have as much actually tangible sites on the landscape. And so, what I tried to do, and again, this is an incomplete list. This is more my shotgun approach to kind of give you a sense of the things just I could find. And there's actually more than this because I was reading letters and correspondence and they were noting other projects, but I just couldn't find like write-ups for them or maps or anything like that. So I didn't list them here. But from 1950, you see North Kona, just in that 1 year alone, they documented 21 heiau, mapped them, one ali'i residential complex and all of its associated features. So not just the heiau itself, but every other archaeological feature around it, right? So entire landscapes and ahupua'a they're mapping, right? On a yearly basis in these 10 years. And so they switched to Puna District in 1951, looking at a bunch of heiau there and the cave system of, oh God, what is the name of that scale? We'll get to it later. In 1952, they returned to North Kona, record a lot of the area from Keauhou, Kahalu'u, all the way down sort of the coast in North Kona. They start to stretch into South Kona by 1954, Pu'uhonua, Honaunau area, all the way down to Ki'ilai, up until 1956. And then I couldn't find any projects after that, but I did notice that one of the last projects they did was on Kauai, which is obviously the farthest away from where they were staying. And that's the heiau complex over there. But they did even more on Kauai and Oahu, but I couldn't find dates and specific information on it, but just sort of anecdotal mention of these things. And so I was under a lot of pressure just to sort of get this PowerPoint done. So yeah, this is entirely an incomplete list, but you can get a sense of just the incomplete list is pretty prolific. Yeah. Here's a picture of Kekahuna, Kelsey on the right, and Naluahine Kaopua, who was a native informant, but like a cultural expert from Kahalu Kona during this time in the 1950s. He was a Hawaiian cowboy. He was a lua expert. He was many things, and he's actually famous in Kona for, his knowledge and his longevity. He lived into a ripe old age. So he was ohana to Kekahuna, and sort of a community connection for him to meet other elders in the area. And then also part of the impetus for him to really be outspoken for that particular region. Kekahuna realized that Kona and the story and the places were key to our understanding of history and Hawaiian identity because of the story of Kamehameha and the Keawe clan and all of the sites associated with them in that district. And that became sort of the front line of his battleground and historic preservation to try to fight the system, essentially. So here we have sort of an example of the types of beautiful maps that he would produce. This one is from 1950, Kahalu'u Ahupua'a, Kamehameha Schools lands today. It's of the Heiau complex and the Lonoika Makahiki residence in that North Kona area. And a lot of you folks are probably familiar with this area because KS has restored many of these heiau on their property today, or in the process of it, and it's become sort of a cultural preserve area for the community. But you can just see sort of the amount of time and detail that went into his mapping. Yeah, this is a huge area to cover, and he had one leg, and he's running tape, and he's enlisting the help of community members, but also Kelsey, right? Kelsey, in his interviews, said that Kekahuna was entirely responsible for the maps because he didn't really know how to map. He was just trying to help him. And that Kelsey focused on interviewing the community members during that time. But I think it's, their work together is a great example of the power of these different fields, and different skill sets, and how you can bring them together in a way that is more holistic in what we produce. So what you see is really an effort to map all of these cultural sites and to include sort of a brief description of the stories and the knowledge surrounding these places. But one thing you'll notice is that he's not mapping them like how an archaeologist would map them today. An archaeologist today would be mapping the ruins and the rubble of what they see. Instead, Kekahuna is looking for the original base stones for a lot of these sites and trying to map what it was supposed to look like. Yeah, I'm sure the integrity of these sites were a lot better in 1950. I think, as integrity drops and sites become more damaged and you have less people who are informants for a region, it's much harder to produce something like this. But he was at the right place at the right time and the right person to do this. And so he drew these maps as if he was recording them on how they were intended to be. And to me, as a Hawaiian and an archaeologist, that's really important because it's sort of teaching me a lesson about, sort of what's important to us as a people. Yeah. Archaeology is a tool. Yeah, it's a field and a discipline, but it's a tool that can be used in different ways. If the way we map sites today isn't necessarily helping us, then we should think about how we can change those things. And in particular, I'm fascinated by these Kekahuna maps because he mapped them in a way in which they were supposed to be. And then these maps became the resource for our generation to try to restore these sites, right? And so this area in Kahalu'u looks amazing today with many of the heiau restored. And none of that restoration could have happened if he didn't map them like this on how they intended to be. Because if you just map them as a piece of rubble, you don't see sort of like where was the wall intact and how was it running? What did the foundations look like? What were the elevations of all parts? Archaeology today does map some of that, but they also map the fall and the rubble all into that. And so unless you're mapping, those details with the keen eye on restoration instead of preservation, those maps today might not be as helpful as how he mapped them in the 1950s. Here's another map from 1954 for Pu'uhonua Honau, now City of Refuge. Again, really just like artwork. You look at these things, so aesthetically pleasing and just beautiful, yeah. But emphasis again on sort of archaeology as a living record and not a dead record. Yeah. And so for Kekahuna, he saw an opportunity to bring that living record and that living spirit into his maps. And so what you see are things like place names all over the place for every little thing. It could be a lua in the ground, little post hole, famous spot where a famous shark lived. I mean, it could be anything that he recorded. He starts to sort of basically plot them on the map, on this sort of mental map, cultural mental map of what this region was and what it still continues to be, for us today. And so you can see all of these little details when you blow up the map that hint at connections to different stories, different genealogies, different important historical figures, deities, and so forth. And you won't see that on more modern archaeological maps or Western archaeological maps. And again, I think that's tied to epistemologically to sort of the thinking, right? Is that, where today archaeology sees sort of the record as something that is static, that we're supposed to preserve and sort of keep as museum pieces, and things that represent a time of the past that aren't maybe as relevant anymore, versus a Hawaiian who's mapping it that sees it as alive, something that is active, something that will eventually be restored, something that is going to be continued. Yeah, a totally different mindset, yeah, between the two. And so you see that in all of these beautiful maps. And again, it wasn't just him, it was Kelsey as well and his amazing work. Theodore Kelsey, although he was Haole, he was a respected Hawaiian language expert in the community. You would think that, sometimes Haoles don't get, credit for those kinds of cultural things, in our community. But when I listened to the Kaleo Hawaii tapes when he was interviewed as a very aged man who was, in his much later years, the Hawaiians that were calling up and speaking to him in Hawaiian, like, had so much respect for him, And so Kelsey was definitely one half of this powerful duo that was producing this kind of information, documentation. And along with this would come were manuscripts that they would develop, yeah, for these places as products. Very much like how we do contract work today, yeah, in cultural resource management. However, much more time and care put into it. Yeah. Sorry. So, oh yeah, okay. So here's sorry. Back here. So here are some of the photos I ordered from the museum, and I decided to just throw them in because it costs money to buy these or to use these. And so these were sort of examples of some of the little things that they would produce him in, like almost like descriptions or cards that him and Kelsey would produce, outside of the contracted manuscript and mapping of the cultural sites, and the studies that they were supposed to produce for landowners. They would make these little sort of like index cards in a way of all these different sites that they had. So here's an example of the royal residential site of Keawe Kekahiali'i o Kamoku, right? who is one of the high chiefs that helped to establish Haleokeawe, Pu'uhonau, city of refuge. And so here they are cleaning the site, yeah, and giving a description of the place. And oftentimes Kelsey was the photographer on these. Yeah. There's a lot of cards like this regarding cultural sites. Here's another one for Kaneaki, in which I found no report and no map, but we know he did this study. And so, someone's going to have to go and pull all of these things together into one repository so we can see really the entire body of work of Kekahuna and Kelsey. But this is sort of another hint that, they did actually more than what is present in their collection. Yeah. So this is the Heiau of Kaneaki. And so that means that they mapped it, they did a study on it, and then Kaneaki is another place that was restored, right? And Makaha on the west side. Pu'uhonau is another place that was restored. Kahalu'u, that we looked at the other map, was another place that was restored. And then one of the last projects he worked on was Kane'iolomea, Heiau in Kauai. That was a heiau, but also sort of like a sporting arena area. And this is another place that was restored as well, right? And so some of the best examples of Hawaiian restoration today, the basis comes from the Kekahuna maps and his foresight in documenting these places in the way he did. For sort of the archaeological mapping, I will note that even though he mapped them how they intended to be, he often had descriptions on the sides or in his notes that also highlighted the current condition of the walls or the vegetation so that people could make sense of what was going on if they were to go there, physically. So that's some of the archaeological mapping that he did. Again, like I can't emphasize enough the importance of us to start to think about archaeology in that way, for us to see it as a living record, one that is critical for the ongoing survival of our people, our cultural identity, and our well-being. And so Kekahuna had a firm understanding of that. And hats off to Kelsey too for just being an amazing supporter of that work and also a leader in that front as well. Sorry, oh, actually it's 12:50 already. Let me kind of wrap it up. I didn't realize I was going this long. Okay, so to kind of wrap this up, the last part I kind of wanted to touch on was his articles and opinion pieces, because oftentimes what you'll see is there's really a dichotomy, right, in my opinion, where you have academic scholarship, academic trained scholars that maybe are trained in anthropological sort of fields and techniques and archaeological fields and techniques, and it's a little bit of an elitist group. I'm not gonna lie. It's a privileged place to be, right? To be able to get your degree in those areas, and then you have like sort of community members that have their own knowledge, right? And are skilled as well in other things and have a completely insider perspective to stuff. And so oftentimes what I've seen is, continuing today, is oftentimes the academics don't want to compromise their position of privilege by rocking the boat too much in terms of advocacy. And so they remain silent on a lot of things, versus Kekahuna and Kelsey, who are like in that 10-year period, they're just gunning, man. I mean, I was so inspired by their essays that it blew my mind. Like, I mean, that was the thing that I gravitated even more than their prolific amount of cultural knowledge and documentation that they put together, was their advocacy. Because he wrote these things, like 70 years ago, but this man is lighting a fire in the next generation, right? Because we now have access to his writings and we read these things. The knowledge of our native sons and daughters, a plea for Hawaiian preservation, two of the best things I've ever written. Not because like it's the best writing that I ever read, but it's because it's resonating in me so much that this guy said this 70 years before today. And he couldn't have said more truer words, than at that moment. And that, it sort of validates a lot of the concerns of the community today and how historic preservation is, for the large part, failing in Hawaii. Not because of this community, right, of Hawaiians and historic preservation lovers, but because of a broken state, and federal system. And so here's a list of just again, incomplete list of some of the essays that he wrote that I was able to find, some of which made it into newspaper articles as op-eds, but some of them that didn't. And then he has the rejection letters in his collections, right? And I'm kind of like, oh my God, this is such an important piece, and he couldn't get this published up into, the public, right? So he writes a bunch, him and Kelsey write a bunch, and then Kelsey writes one really good one that I could find too. And so there's probably way more than this, but this is basically just what I could find from digging through their collections. And their collections is not 100% representative of everything they've done, So again, if people are interested, keep digging. I think we can probably double this list. So this is sort of the end of the PowerPoint, and I just wanted to end with sort of some thoughts. Henry Kekahuna is someone that was really the people's champion. I felt like, like when people talk about him in the callers on like the Kaleo Hawaii, when they call in to talk to Kelsey and talk about Kekahuna, he's like a folk legend in the Hawaiian community, because of the work he did, because of his advocacy for the communities and for these sites. He was on the ground, he was with the people, yeah, and his work really demonstrated all that, exuded that in everything he did. Same goes with Kelsey. There are two peas in a pod, those guys, man. They're besties, and there are other really important scholars during that time. And in anthropology at Bishop Museum, and I think their careers went on very different tracks. They're maybe a little bit more brand name. They had a larger platform in terms of getting their ideas and their research out. And so I really want to mahalo this man, and thank him for what he did. Like for me as a Hawaiian archaeologist, one of the few really, that have come through the program with a PhD, like his vision is something that we carry forth today. And he is someone that his spirit lives on in a lot of us and in the work we do. So mahalo.
Thank you for bringing so many issues up. There have been a lot of questions for you. Do you know if this Amalu family was part of Sammy Amalu's?
I'm not sure. I was wondering that too. It wasn't Sam Malu though. It was a different name.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if they're all related.
Is there a record or a diary of Kekuhuna's huaka'i around the island of Hawaii?
No, it just comes in sort of an anecdotal story that he tells in one of the few interviews that was recorded of him. No.
Okay. Did he have any interaction at all with John Stokes, who was going around the island around the
They
same
did.
time?
They did. Interestingly, and he's sort of like the more of the brand name scholar, right? That gets a lot of the credit for, documenting and protecting sort of Hawaiian heiau and stuff like that. He was rubbing elbows with all of these guys. There's a lot of letters and correspondence between all of them in his stuff. And so, it wasn't like he was isolated and sort of like fighting the power from the corner. He was engaging in the academic community, but I say that he didn't get the credit he deserves because you don't hear his name mentioned quite as often, or people being able to explain really what he did. Yeah. So
Do you know much about Kekahuna and Keoki Pinehaka?
I'm not sure who's Kyoki Penihaka.
If the questioner would like to put it into the chat,
Oh,
we'll identify that.
I don't know who Kyoki Penihaka is. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to scroll through these chat Oh, there's a lot of questions. Sorry. Like rambling on over here. And everybody's like,
Kekuewa, I can share some of these with you
okay,
afterwards
sure.
also, and we might be able to post something on the page. But yeah, not to worry about that one in particular. Maybe Ralph, you can continue and
Sure.
ask some more.
Are there good collections of Kekuhuna's hand-drawn maps?
All of his map collections are at the Bishop Museum, and some of them are online on their website.
Okay. Are you aware as to whether the territory or state has signposted any of these valuable sites?
Um, I'm not sure. I'm assuming that some of them, like Keolo Nahihi is one. He called it the Keolo Nahihi tragedy, I guess. There was a controversy about parts of it being destroyed, but I think it's like a state park. Yeah. Some of them are state parks and stuff like that. I don't think that all of them made it in there though, you know.
Yeah, my experience has been that there are relatively few markers of these
Yeah,
historical
signage,
sites.
not too much.
Has have you talked with Patrick Kirsch or any other current archaeologists about Kekehuna's work?
I haven't talked to Pat about it, yeah, I mean, I probably should. I don't see him that often. He's on the other side of campus. So, next time I run into him, I'll definitely try to ask him, see what if he, interacted with him or knew of him. I know he can relate to stories of other archaeologists during, the early times. So he had relationships with them.
How different are the challenges that Kekahuna faced in his time versus historic preservation today?
They're eerily similar. And, the more I read into their advocacy pieces, the more I'm starting to think that it's always been like this. It's not something that collapsed. It's something that never got off the ground in Hawaii. And so, they complain and lament about the same things that we're seeing today, And so some of the things that, obviously the protection of cultural sites being number one, the need to acquire lands and sort of like a land trust sort of idea. They were putting that out early on. Um, the problems with archaeological permitting, they highlight that. Yeah. Um, the lack of enforcement of the rules and penalties for people that are destroying or selling archaeological resources. Um, the sort of the elitist sort of perspective or sort of like gateway, I guess, of the universities in not recruiting and training Native Hawaiians to do this kind of work. He talks about that early on. Like that was something that like shocked me, right? And so there the lack of vision and foresight in trying to plan for cultural tourism or incorporating culture into tourism, he points that out totally. Like he said, like, hey, if you're gonna do it right, include Hawaiians, have authentic culture, like we don't need to make this up, And so, these sites can also function, in some ways if the community is okay with it. And so, he's coming up with trying to think of solutions early on that, in my opinion, was so far ahead of its time that it doesn't really even resonate until now. Yeah.
The one that struck me was Kamakahonu, and he talks about the value, the economic engine that cultural sites are able to generate.
Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
so.
Yeah.
Was Kekahuna accepted as an archaeologist during his time?
I mean, I can't speak for people during that time, but just from the fact that nobody mentioned him, like any of the main archaeologists, they don't mention him in anything. Yeah. It makes me feel that they didn't consider him as an archaeologist. Yeah.
Okay. In what
But
ways was his work different from conventional Western archaeology?
yeah, so some of the things he was doing are things that I'm advocating for today. It's really, like decentralizing archaeology a little bit, not to say that it's not important because it totally is. We know that the material record physical record is so important as a source of knowledge. However, he recognized early on the importance of it to not be divorced from the cultural context and information. And in order to access that, you needed to, one, be able to speak Hawaiian and look into the archival records where he worked at one point. And then two, you needed to do ethnography and actually talk to the community because the community is still interacting and living with these places. They're carrying forth the memories from the past and they have something to say. And their connection to this place is really what makes it cultural resources. Cultural resources by themselves are not cultural resources, in my opinion. It requires a group of people to have some kind of meaning and attachment assigned to these things. If that's absent, then what are we really studying?
Did he himself have mentors?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. He often cites sort of the community members as his sources of knowledge. And so he'll drop names of people he interviewed and worked with in different places as sort of the badge of legitimacy, in the work he did. And so yeah, I think Naluahine was definitely one. I know he was really close to him and became a mentor in a lot of ways to him. Yeah, and kind of the work he did and sort of the vibrato that he brought to sort of the fights, because he knew what was at stake.
Where can we get copies of the manuscripts,
Yeah, all of the
publications?
yeah, they're both in the State Archives and Bishop Museum. Yeah, the Bishop Museum collection is a little smaller. They have all the maps, and their collection for Kekahuna and Kelsey is much smaller. Yeah, like one or two boxes and kind of a range of random things. If the Hawaii State Archives, I think because they used to work there, has a lot of stuff from them, many, many boxes.
Well,
Some of which is online, but most of which is not.
what is it about the archives that you think um, convinced him to go into archaeology?
I have no idea. I'm gonna keep digging on this because I'm fascinated by him and how he sort of got to that point. But it must have, it wasn't just him and Kelsey too at the archives. There are photos with other kind of prominent scholars at that time that were not like the brand name scholars from the museum, but Hawaiians that were steeped in sort of ethnography and archival researchers that worked with them as well. Yeah, so I think they had a little community over there that was, doing some really cool stuff, and they're just playing off of each other's energy in terms of inspiring each other.
So you mentioned that his religious upbringing, there wasn't a lot of material, but do you have anything that
No, I mean, I'm assuming that because of his name. I thought like, wow, what an unusual name. And Andrea had asked me when we were prepping for this, what does the name mean? And I said, I have no idea. And then so I looked it up, and his name and his dad's name comes from Hawaiianized Hebrew terms that
Mhm.
biblical, I think. And so, because I'm not Christian and I don't read the Bible, I didn't even want to try to take a crack at interpreting that. So, usually people don't have names like that unless they come from really Christian families.
Yeah, I think that sums up the questions that, oh, let's see. If there's any one. Nope, I think we've covered most of the questions that came in the chat.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you. I want you to continue your thought. I did have one last question from somebody, which I thought might be a good way to wrap is Angela asked, does Kekahuna have any descendants who could provide more perspective on his vision? I wonder if you came across anything in your research,
Um,
Kekuewa.
well, we did have a student named Leilani Kekahuna that came through our field school program, and she was a descendant of his, but I don't think she knew really too much about that. And so, you know, she was interested in archaeology and stuff like that. And she's a teacher now in Kona, actually. And so, oh, is she there? I think she's on. Wait, yeah,
I think I know her actually.
yeah. And so, you know,
Cool.
she's amazing, and maybe she can speak to some of that. But I do have
Oh,
friends
wow.
that know family members, but I just didn't get a chance to kind of reach out to them.
Ralph,
Do
did
we expect a book project out of this on his life?
yeah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'd be interested in trying to maybe, I don't know about a book, but definitely I sort of it kind of made me think about maybe trying to do a like an edited volume of something where we have a number of essays from more contemporary research around Hawaiian, you know, knowledge and cultural sites, and then, you know, sprinkling it in with some of his essays. That would be, I think, really cool.
And
And
those
with
historical
Kekuewa's
maps.
pictures, yeah, and the maps and the photos from Kelsey as well, which is another database of things.
Mm,
So
that'd be so valuable.
yeah,
It was birthed here today. You heard it here. Ralph, did you have anything else you wanted to say, or should I
Yeah,
wrap?
this has been in the
Fascinating.
series of excellent speakers we've had so far. And our next speaker,
Yeah, I can.
you want to go over that?
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that.
Okay. Uh,
Cool.
thanks again
Keiko,
for your talk today. It was a very engaging talk.
yeah. Thanks so much, Ralph. Thanks so much, Andrew. I appreciate it.
yeah, it was incredible. Thank you so much, Kikueva. And thank you everyone who's still on for joining us. And I want to thank Michelle Kisek, my colleague who's been providing technical support, and also invite everyone to join us next week, Wednesday, February 28th, rather, at noon, when Aki Sinoto will present on Kenneth Emery. Please take the survey at the end when you log off, and please consider signing up for the HHF e-newsletter. And if you haven't already, we'll provide information on heritage events, news, educational events like this and others. And thank you so much for supporting this series, everyone. This is just really rich and wonderful. So mahalo to everyone, and ohui ho.